Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of By the Way to Purposeful Procurement. My name is Philip Ideson. I'm the founder and managing director here at Art of Procurement. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Rich Ham, the CEO of Fine Tune. Rich, welcome to the show.
Thank you. As always, happy to be here.
Well, today we're going to have a conversation with Kristine Morton. Kristine is Director of Strategic Sourcing at Unleashed Brands. And it's going to be an interesting one as we kind of go into some of the kind of, we've talked in this series a lot about the theory of incentive structures. We want to talk a little bit about the practice and practice in reality, I think, as well, of different incentive structures. And so, Kristine, let me welcome you to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Hey guys, happy to be here.
Now, the question that I often ask at the beginning of most of the podcasts that I do is, certainly when I'm speaking to procurement practitioners, is, did you find procurement or did procurement find you? And how did you find yourself in this profession that we all love?
So I would say that procurement found me. When I started out, I worked mainly in the restaurant industry. So I waited tables throughout college, went on to be a manager for Chewy's restaurants for about 6 years. After having my first child, it was time to kind of find, that real job. As they say, with a more predictable schedule. And so I ended up working for Cheddar's corporate office. And I started by supporting our SVP of purchasing and development. And that was kind of my first time knowing that that was even a thing. And so it found me.
Phil, before we ask Kristine, and we're going to ask you, Kristine, in a moment, to kind of walk us through the major stops in your career journey, I have to relate the story of when I first spoke to Kristine about this project. I was introduced to Kristine actually by a recent, by the way, guest, Keith Robinson, my VP of Pest Control Services, the bugs guru, the board certified entomologist, Keith Robinson, treasure of a human. And Kristine and Keith had worked together years back, and so I talked to Kristine and I shared with her that we were on this journey of exploring certain flaws in the way procurement tends to be incentivized. And I kind of walked her through a handful of the specific flaws that we were talking about. And she reacted by saying, well, that all sounds stupid. And I said, well, yeah, but you're not like, aware of them. And she was like, well, no, I've never worked in an environment like that. And when we talked about this with Kelly, I asked Kelly, I said, what are the odds that somebody could work 15 years in various corporate procurement roles and not even be aware of some of these incentive systems that we've been discussing? Yeah. And Kelly said, oh, it's got to be like 1 in 1,000. It can't be common at all. And yet when you hear about Kristine's journey, and I think this is going to be one of the interesting threads of this discussion today, it starts to make a little more sense. So Kristine, if you would, could you walk our audience through your major career stops in a little bit of detail, and just and then we can circle back to why your answer might have been what it was.
So as I mentioned, my first kind of foray into purchasing was with Cheddar's. I started as an executive assistant, and after a year or so, it was kind of time to decide where would I like to go in the future. And at that point, I really was enjoying purchasing. And so Cheddar's is majority corporate owned, with just a handful of franchisees. So that's kind of how I started. I was there for about 6 years. And then when Darden acquired Cheddar's, I decided I didn't want to move to Florida. So I was hired and brought into a company called JMC Distribution, which is a sister company of CC's Pizza. And so, and that kind of put me behind the curtain for distributors. I was really interested to learn kind of how that worked behind the scenes. But that was my first exposure to a majority franchise system, which is completely different than corporate, because corporate, they're your stores, and whatever you roll out or whatever you require, they do. And that's not necessarily how it goes in the franchise system. So anyway, so I was there for about 3 years. After that, I moved on to a company called American Meat Companies. It's a meat processing plant out of California. They had opened a plant here in DFW. Stayed there for a couple of years. After that, I moved on over here to Unleashed Brands, and I've been here for about 2 years. When I first started, I was brought in to work on special projects. That's the strategic sourcing in my title. But after a year, I was moved over to our merchandise and retail department. And I guess I should back up and explain a little bit more about Unleashed Brands, because it's not that a lot of people know. So Unleashed Brands owns and operates 8 youth franchise brands. So these are places like Urban Air, The Little Gym, Sylvan, and several others. And so it is all franchise. We have a handful of corporates. So again, I'm in another franchise type system. So I think that brings me to present day.
My son just spent many hours jumping on the Urban Air trampolines a couple of weekends ago with all of his 13-year-old buddies. Yeah, no, he was a good customer for a day. Here's what I want to note, Phil, and if I'm not mistaken, Kristine, correct me if I'm wrong, but Cheddar's was private equity backed. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got small to mid-size private equity backed enterprise. You've got small family owned enterprise. And you've got franchise-owned communities that Kristine has served, where those are her internal customers. If ever there was a collection of business types that was acutely P&L focused, that's it. Yep. I just described some of the most acutely P&L focused enterprises, and so it actually makes sense in the end that Kristine would have managed to live without the burdens of these flawed systems of incentive that we talk about in this episode. And that made for me, Kristine, to be a fascinating guest.
Yeah, I mean, is that because you're so focused within those organizations has been related to savings, or has savings really been a part of the way that you have been managed or assessed, or the value contribution that you have brought has been looked on by others? I'd love to know kind of how you have been, what value and ROI looked on from the investments in procurement in those organizations.
So it can vary. I mean, there are definitely, there's a goal to find savings, obviously. So anytime there's an opportunity, whether it be a new product, a new service, but it's not always about savings. Sometimes it's about improving the product. So if we can find a product that's the same price but a better quality, then that's also a value we bring. So our goals usually are centered around those types of projects.
Now, Kristine, when you use the word savings, I think you actually mean savings that means the company spends less on whatever it buys, not some projection of what might happen based on a contract you just signed, right? In your world, savings has always meant it's got to be real, which gets me to my question. One of the themes that we've talked about throughout this project is validation, and how the systems of incentives that procurement has operated under for a long time have not required validation, because the savings is recognized and rewarded, that the buyer is credited with the initiative at the moment a contract is signed, not at the moment it actually hits the P&L and sticks over time. And yet, in your career, I have to think that validation of your initiatives has played a much more significant role, that there have been expectations that your outputs always be real, that they hit the P&L and stick over time. But I don't want to assume. Let me ask, is that right? Is that part of your career journey?
Absolutely, because if we put something out there and we're saying that there's a savings or there's a value that we haven't tested. So for us, I was thinking about our conversation, actually, Rich, and for validation, that kind of comes in our testing phase. So again, even if it's a service, a new product, we would test it in a percentage of our locations, just to validate that there are savings or there is a value before we would even roll it out. But we also ended the whole project life cycle with measurement. So then we're continually watching, we're making sure that whatever we've contracted, the price is being, they're, charging us the right price. what, the consistency of the product, if we're looking at
Mm-hmm.
customer, because everything we do, and I've mentioned this to you before, like we work for over 1,000 CEOs. These are all people running their own business. They are watching their P&L very closely. And if we're not doing what we're saying we're doing, they're going to let us know.
Surely. Yeah.
How does that impact, how you position the impact that procurement can have when you're working with all these, as you say, essentially many different CEOs who, all have their own challenges, opportunities, things within their P&Ls that they would like to see some help with. But on the other hand, your relationship with them is one of a dotted line. You're a service provider essentially to them within the system. So how does that affect how you position how procurement can help them?
Well, I mean, it really, and you really hit something, because, something that may be of a large value for us, some of our owners may not be on the radar of others. So really it's just looking at the different opportunities. And again, I mean, there's so many variables in procurement, whether it's products for a restaurant, services, the retail and merchandise I do. You'd have to kind of evaluate the impact and prioritize. So currently in my role, we're starting to kind of get our feet wet into the indirect services, and which is going to be a huge impact because people spend a lot of money on these types of things, whether it's their waste removal, pest control. We're looking at deregulated states and their electricity usage. So I think really just trying to evaluate the opportunities and then going after the ones that make sense. But again, for these programs I just spoke about, it's not something that we're going to force people to participate. We have to put together a program that is appealing and are obviously showing savings for our franchisees, because it's going to be optional and they're not going to opt in if it's not a savings or showing value for them.
How do you kind of gather requirements across such a range of, as we talked about, there's different interests. And so when I talk about requirements, it's yes, expense management is going to be one of them for a subset and maybe a large subset, but there's going to be quality, or there's going to be availability, or, there are other value drivers that you can be. There may be local sourcing, investing in local communities through sourcing. There may be lots of kind of different requirements as you're putting together something which is hopefully going to benefit the entire system. But you can't just do it with the, with one in mind, build it for one, and then wonder why nobody else uses the deal. You want as many people as possible to use the program as possible.
Right. And I mean, so again, it goes back to what specifically we are working on. For programs and services, like I just mentioned, those we would not require. Because again, some cities, you're using their services for electricity or can't, participate. But how do you get those great savings if you can't guarantee everybody's participating? So there is kind of a balance there. But, on the other end, so specifically in our kind of food area, my colleague works on our F&B, those items can be required because we do need some consistency among all of our different parks so that our guests know what to expect, whether they're visiting here in Texas or somewhere else. So it's kind of a balance on what we can require and can't require. And we just work closely with the operations team to really determine, what that would be.
Kristine, if I could pick up on this thread of validation, I find myself thinking that you must often realize, and I find it noteworthy, by the way, Phil, that I heard two terms, literally terms that Kristine clearly uses quite a bit in her work life, testing and measurement, that were both built around the validation component, which is something we see so little of in so many large procurement organizations. And yet in her world, it's like an essential part of the process. I would guess, Kristine, but tell me please if I've got this wrong, but I would guess that you are often finding that after you've done the work of putting an initiative out there, putting an agreement in place, launching it, you've done the testing, and then you've pressed go. And then it goes live, supplier keys a deal into their systems, however that happens, and the first invoicing gets generated under the program, and your stakeholders are starting to hopefully enjoy the fruits of this project. My guess is somewhere around here, you are often noticing that there's still more work to be done. Am I on the right track here?
You are. And again, it kind of boils down to what specific project or product or what we're working on. Some of it will be a lot more visibility in than others. So for example, when we're talking about food products coming out of our distributor, we have that visibility. We have access to their reporting. And in that sense, what we're really checking is to make sure our distributor is, entering the correct pricing and stuff that we've set for whatever item we've rolled out. When it comes to services, it's a little harder. We're not paying those bills for our franchisees. And so anything we'd want to look at and validate, we have to rely on them to provide that to us. Now, as we roll something out, we may have a partner that has a wonderful dashboard that allows us to continue to watch the program. But as far as comparing it to what they were doing, it's just a little harder. But again, they're looking at this stuff. They know, like if I paid X amount for electricity this month, and then, they can look at it and see. So some of it, we rely on their feedback.
When you own a program, how long post signature are you typically staying involved, or is the answer just like continuous?
Continuous. I mean, so it's a new program. It's a new vendor. They're now my vendor. I'm doing, quarterly business reviews or, annually, depending on what it is. If there's an issue, I'm the one that's stepping in to try to resolve it. So it's, it's ongoing. It's never just, we're done and move on.
Phil, I want to throw it to you for the next question. But before I do, I just want to note that is category management. A thing that may be dead in many large corporate environments, but that's what it is. I often see people who have the title category manager, and then I talk to them about what they do, and I'm like, no, here's the definition of manage. Nothing that you just described measures up to the actual dictionary definition of the word manage, but that is category management.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you're in this environment, you're providing this service where there is also nowhere to hide. In large enterprises, oftentimes there's, lots of people that are involved in, let's say, lots of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. But then when you get to time of sourcing, it's like, okay, I'm kind of done. And that's going to go off to the business stakeholder to manage. Come and let me know when we're 3 years down the line and we need to go and source this again. Yeah. And so we get completely disconnected from the impact of what we've done. Yeah. We get disconnected from alignment. Have we actually saw something which the business needs? Yeah. And we get called in when there's a problem. And that's the only time we ever really hear about it again. And we move on to the next one, and you kind of just in a bit of a sourcing factory.
Not category management.
No.
Yeah.
No, I mean, sometimes we use category management. I think there's a lot of psychology at play, involved in what we call ourselves and how we talk about ourselves. And category management is one of those where in some organizations it's truly impactful, or in others it's almost to kind of justify why we exist as opposed to because we're driving some different value from implementing it. Yeah. I think that, you've spoken a lot, Kristine, about how each individual project that you work or program that you have is different in some way, shape, or form. That how you approach something is different. And that speaks to kind of true alignment with the business, because it's really based upon what does the business need from something, as opposed to I'm just going to push something on the folks within the organization. My question about that really is then how at a program by program or a category by category or sourcing event by sourcing event level, do you kind of define what success looks like?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Again, I mean, it just, however you're starting the project, at that point what the project's going to bring. Again, whether the goal is to find savings, then that's what we want to look for after we've rolled it out. If the goal is to, currently, like I said, I'm doing a lot of retail and merchandise. So it's a lot different than what I'm used to. So success in that area looks like not only are my franchisees buying the products, they're actually, the guests are also buying it. So then I know, okay, out with something that's appealing to everyone. That was a success. For a program, that one's still a little, like I mentioned, it's just a little more difficult in a franchise environment because we don't have that visibility. But success would be, getting feedback from our franchisees, like, hey, this new uniform provider, they're great. Or the trash, I haven't had any issues with my trash supplier I used to have. Things like that would be how we'd find success. But again, it just depends on what the goal of the project is and how we measure it afterwards.
I'm struck by, as I hear Kristine describe her work, that, if global conglomerate X, global manufacturer Y, were to say, I want to adopt the way of doing things that Kristine describes, of course, we would need more Kristines in those departments. This takes time and effort. And so, but obviously Unleashed Brands and Cheddar's, and, we're not in the business of wasting money. These were acutely fiscally mindful businesses who said, no, there's more benefit here than cost. This is why we're going to build it this way. And so my question for you here, Kristine, would be, why would you take the time and effort to do everything you've described, the holistic category management, the validation, and I'm kind of thinking about this question through the lens of, on one hand, there's credibility with stakeholders, but at the same time, there's also through the lens of just, your job being purposeful. As you're doing this work and taking the time to go beyond just being a sourcing machine, a contract negotiator, and that's all you are, why?
Well, my job is to support my franchisees. I've been brought in to help them run their operations as well as they can. And like you said, if I didn't, I do it because I care. Why would I do all this work up front and then not make sure that it's what I said it was? It's also a little bit of ethics. We talk about that a lot in procurement. Why would we say this is what this is going to do for you guys without knowing for sure and not following up? And sometimes things don't work out. We're talking as if everything measures and it's great. But if you're not following up and not realizing that whatever you said was going to happen didn't happen, then you're not going to learn from that either.
What a great answer.
Yeah, because I'm thinking like one of the purposes of what we're trying to do is how do we take learnings and try and help, organizations of all sizes start to think about their incentive structures, and perhaps some of the incentives they got are actually disincentives to do the things that you've been talking about doing.
Right.
And we're getting in each other's, we sometimes get in our way in terms of what we put out there in terms of metrics. And it sounds like, you're really deeply embedded in the business. You're not kind of sitting in, here's procurement over here and here's the business over there, and I'm just going to help you kind of run through some contractual terms. You're really looking at how can we help use supply chains and the supply base to drive revenue, and it's not just about saving money either. You talked about testing in stores. That's the merchandising. That's all revenue generation. And that's almost like it's a holy grail for us in procurement, is how can we connect what we do with revenue? And that's through how aligned you are with the business. Because if you weren't, they would go and try and figure it out on their own. But the fact that they're actually allowing you to be part of that conversation speaks to what you've done from a relational perspective.
When I think a lot of the connection comes from, as I mentioned when we started, through college, I waited tables. I was at Chewy's as a manager for 6 years. So I'm very embedded in operations. So a lot of times, and some of my job isn't always just doing the value. We have to make sure we have product. We have to make sure these services are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So anytime I get approached with an issue that one of our franchisees is seeing, it always takes me back to when I was managing. And you just want to do whatever you can to make their job easier. They're there running a business. They shouldn't have to worry about running out of something or not having their trash picked up or whatever. So I think that also kind of is how I'm so connected, or what makes me so connected with the owners.
how is your performance measured, or the perception of your impact, therefore, within Unleashed Brands? What are they looking at you to achieve? And is there, numerical metrics that you've got to achieve against, or is it more on the customer service? And I'm enabled the business, and the business is, finds value in the service I'm providing them.
So our goals usually, they're not specific as far as like, hey, you've got to find X amount of savings this year. It'd be more like, for example, this year we want to roll out a trash program. So that would be one of my big goals. Did you, and at the end, were you able to achieve that? So it's more just actual programs and things that we're targeting, not a specific number. But ultimately those do yield the savings and the value.
Well, when you serve a community of small business owners, if they adopt your programs, you kind of know they were good. There's baked in validation just right there. And of course, you're doing your own validation on top of it to make sure your work was purposeful, to make sure it was time well spent, as you said. And there's even, I love the notion of there even being an ethical consideration to it as well. Like I feel a responsibility to make sure that it works out the way it was supposed to. But there's also, at the end of the day, this assurance baked in that says, like, yeah, these are small business owners. If the deal sucks, they're not going to participate. If it's good, they are. And yeah.
And they all talk. So, if one has opted in and one hasn't, and they're having a great experience, they're going to talk about it. And that's part of the test piece too. Like we would always test not only just in corporate locations, we would include some franchise locations as well. Because at the end of it all, if we've decided to move on and we're rolling this out, we want some feedback from somebody other than, the home office or corporate. Because, other franchisees respect and will value what they have to say. So they, if we have another owner out there saying, oh, this was great, we, found that XYZ went really well, then that's going to sell the program a lot better to our other owners, as opposed to me going up there and saying, this is going to be great, you're going to save all this money, you should, participate.
Yeah. Kristine, as we approach the end of our time here, I want to talk about, let's talk about our feelings. I want to talk about how it really feels for you when you see a project through all the way from strategy setting up through validation, testing, and measurement. And when you see your efforts in fighting kind of for the initiative played a role in making it real, and then your stakeholders see that they got what you signed them up for and it worked and they like it. How does that feel?
Well, it feels great. And I hate to be stereotypical and I hope I don't get beat up, but as a female, I love to find savings. I love a sale. So if I'm out there able to save, $1 million for the company, that feels really awesome. So yeah, it's just like we talked about, it makes your job purposeful. It helps, and then it strengthens your relationship too with your franchise community. So you roll something out, it was very successful. Next time you come and approach them with something else, they're more, they more likely to opt in than otherwise if you did not follow through and not have success in these other projects.
Such a great answer, Phil. And what it shows us is that on the theme, one of the themes that we're exploring here is, you don't have to be driving out hundreds of millions of tons of carbon emissions from a supply chain for a global conglomerate. You don't have to be, driving millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to social impact programs. You can even find purpose, real purpose, in your procurement job just by making your efforts real, making sure the stakeholders get what it was you were pursuing. Like there's purpose in that, in helping the business win. And that's purposeful procurement too.
Well, helping the business win, I think, is one of the themes of the conversation, right? Because it shows how much alignment that Kristine has with the rest of the business.
Totally aligned.
And so many times I will often speak to people who have big savings targets, and it's like, say, cost savings at all costs. And you can achieve all the cost savings goals in the world. Everybody hates you. And you probably, you're at risk for being fired because everyone hates you. You can miss your savings targets. and you can be enabling the business in what they want to do and what they need to do to succeed. Everybody in the business will stand up for you. And, you're not going to lose your job in that scenario. That's the philosophy I had when I was in procurement, was the savings will follow, hopefully, but I'm not going to focus on the savings.
Yeah.
And sometimes we put savings at the detriment of everything else. The other thing just to note is, obviously we talked at the beginning that Kristine's worked in a lot of organizations that are very heavily P&L focused, but in it, we have told ourselves this story that in a very heavily P&L focused business, savings is the only thing that matters. And obviously it doesn't.
No, of course not. Quality is especially important, it sounds like, in Kristine's world. The service that her stakeholders are receiving from the suppliers she's selected, it goes way beyond just the hard dollar cost. But I also love the fact that in Kristine's world, savings means savings the way it means to me and you when we're sitting around our kitchen table. So, Kristine Morton, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for bringing us a perspective on real procurement, real category management with real results that are validated, measured, and how that feels purposeful. This has been a great conversation that I know our listeners are going to love.
Thank you so much, Kristine.
Appreciate it, guys. Thank you.